So it's similar and different from cross-examination. So cross-examination, and I think this is kind of what you all do in some of your other debate styles. Those of you who have done maybe policy or NTNU or something like along those lines, where one person's asking questions and the other person's answering it. The difference is that since you're sharing time, it changes a lot of your strategy and a lot of kind of the questions that you're going to be asking. So your goals are going to be similar in many ways. So you're wanting to highlight new information. You're wanting to kind of get to the bottom of different questions and different ideas. But the goals also differ in certain ways too, because there's less emphasis on getting really deep into the content, given that there's the shared time where you don't get to ask a bunch of follow-up questions. And instead, you have a higher priority, a higher emphasis on sounding smooth, sounding concise, and making some clear arguments. So Crossfire, since you really only have 1.5 minutes to yourself for asking questions and getting answers, you got to really prioritize kind of some big picture things and getting to the bottom of some critical issues that maybe will help the judge understand what's going on in the debate. We also have to value control of the debate as well as kind of mutual respect for our opponents. So cross-examination, where one person's asking and one person's answering, is going to have a clear hierarchy. So the questioner is controlling the cross-examination, and they're going to keep asking questions and set the pace and set the topic of discussion and all that. But in Crossfire, you don't really have that freedom. You don't get to ask a bunch of setup questions and leading questions to help get to complex ideas. Instead, Crossfire is kind of boundless. So anyone can be asking questions at any point. And so it sets the stage for kind of maybe a lot of confusion for some of your judges. So it's really important that we have kind of some control and some respect of our opponents and creating that hierarchy that we lose when everyone can ask questions. So one thing that I think that is important to note is that when you all were talking about open Crossfire, so earlier when someone asked the question of can anyone speak or is it just the two speakers? While sometimes people and debaters might come to the mutual agreement that like everyone can ask a question anytime, you should always try and keep it to the speakers who are supposed to be speaking, because this is kind of their opportunity to show off for the judge and show off what they know. And so you don't want to kind of waste that opportunity by having your partner speak over you the whole time and kind of take over your time to kind of impress the judge. So it's really important that you kind of keep this organization and keep this structure where you're giving the speeches and asking the questions and answering the questions, so that way you can show to the judge that you know what you're talking about. So we'll go to kind of the asking of questions and how to prioritize what you're asking. So first, there's clarification questions. So these are questions that you're asking to try and see if you can get to a deeper understanding or understand something a little bit more that maybe you missed in their speech, in your opponent's speech, or something that you're kind of confused about still. So this ensures that you don't misunderstand an argument. So Crossfire gives you an opportunity to maybe say, what are you talking about with this? Or I missed this argument. Can you please explain it one more time? So that way you can have good answers. You can be able to set up your future answers. So if you think that your opponents are kind of explaining it in a tricky way, you can get them to explain it in a way that's more favorable to the rebuttals that you want to have. Clarification questions are important because you obviously don't want to miss what your opponents are saying in the debate. And you want to make sure that when you're giving answers, your judge understands what your answers are about. And so if you think that they need to explain something more for the judge to understand what you're going to say in your next speech, then it's important to kind of ask clarification questions. But these aren't really the main goal of Crossfire. So really what we want to do is kind of get to the bottom of some maybe difficult ideas. So we want to challenge the credibility of who we're debating and what we're debating. So there are two kind of main ways to do this. So first, we can challenge their source. So we can show that their source is missing and their evidence is missing key qualifications, or their evidence is using maybe faulty data, or it's being misinterpreted, or there's some big issue with their evidence, and we don't feel like it's up to the standard that we need to have for our arguments. So their source could be not good, and so we can ask questions that kind of let the judge know that those things are some problems that they're experiencing with their arguments. The second way, oh, someone have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. So in policy debate, a lot of times you would be asking or calling for evidence and then later challenging it in a speech. Are you saying that in Crossfire, you would be asking to see that evidence because they may not be like you may not know exactly who the source is or know enough about the evidence yourself without seeing it in order to challenge it? Because I think a lot of times in Taiwan, they're like, well, I need to see this because I don't even feel like challenging it until I know what it is.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on your judge and who you're debating on whether or not kind of you have to use Crossfire time to ask for the sources and the evidence. I think that generally most people are pretty okay with you just asking before Crossfire to see the evidence that your opponents are introducing. And so it usually doesn't count against you in Crossfire time to kind of ask for the source and get a second to look over the evidence. And you can use your prep time for those things. And then in the Crossfire, it's more about kind of drawing out and highlighting the issues that are within the evidence.
So you would say, I want to use some prep time. Can I see this evidence before Crossfire initiates? Is that what I understand? Okay. Yeah. Just trying to make that clear because that will be a new thing, I think, for a lot of the debaters. They're always asking for evidence during Crossfire.
Yeah, you don't want to really, because if you're asking for evidence during Crossfire, you're wasting a lot of kind of the time that you can get to some of these deeper ideas. So, yeah.
The one thing I want to add to that though is remember, although it's usually a good idea to let just one person focus on doing the Crossfire, we are modifying the original public forum style to focus more on teamwork, right? So one other way you could solve this problem is if you ask for a piece of evidence in the Crossfire, one person can make that request, and then your team or your partners can look over that evidence while you continue doing the Crossfire. And then maybe they could chime in once they've gotten a chance to see it with their own questions. Since we're kind of letting everyone talk during all of the different speech times.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense, and that's definitely a good use of everyone's time is to always kind of have someone prepping and preparing the next portion of your questions with maybe some of the new information that you get from these Crossfire questions.
But I do like and note the fact that because of the prep time, by the way, for all of the people here for NTNU, I believe there's going to be set prep time. And I'm not sure if they're putting a set prep time before Crossfire. I believe they're doing that before speeches, which still would call the question that you could probably say, hey, I want this evidence before we start Crossfire, and you could interrupt the timekeepers probably to ask for that. I will double check with Charlotte about that. But unlike US or international debate, you will have set prep time instead of like running prep time that you use.
Yeah, and so if you're ever confused about whether or not you can ask for evidence before your Crossfire, you can always ask your judge. And if your judge doesn't want that to happen, they can just say no, and it usually won't cause you any trouble. So it never really hurts to ask. So yeah, the Crossfire, you can kind of challenge the source of the evidence. The second way that you can challenge credibility is by showing that the debaters maybe are missing some of their qualifications or credibility in talking about some of these arguments. So this isn't really saying like them as people shouldn't be talking about this, but instead showing that maybe you have a firmer grasp of what's going on in the topic and with the subject. So the more that your opponents kind of fumble with some key questions and maybe are missing some information in some of their arguments, that might show that the judge should trust you a little bit more and should understand what you're saying more and might be more willing to vote for your arguments. So if you ask them kind of a basic question and a question about them explaining their arguments and they can't really do that, then it's always going to really be advantageous for you because it's going to show that maybe your opponents aren't able to kind of explain some of these arguments, and your judge is going to think that you all are more informed or are more better suited to win the debate, given that you kind of have a lot of these arguments tied down and your opponents maybe are missing some of those. The next section is that you can undermine your opponent's logic. So you can point out some inconsistencies or some of their ridiculous claims. So maybe if you think that they're saying something that your judge or most people wouldn't really believe, then you can ask them to further explain these arguments, or maybe reference how kind of silly they are. And that will kind of get the judge to be a little bit more dismissive of what your opponents are saying. So the goal of these crossfires and these type of undermining logic arguments is to instill doubt and have your judge begin to think the way that you want them to think. So you can kind of frame your question to get them to buy into some of the arguments that you're going to have. So maybe the background information you include with your questions, or the arguments you're setting up, will get your judge to kind of pay attention to the important arguments that you think are going to set up and decide the debate. Did someone else raise their hand?
I raised it again because I like to ask questions for clarification, normally for the others, I think. So when you said by frame your question in a way, what you're saying is you can't just say, hey, that's a fallacy during cross-examination. Instead, you're saying, like, ask a question that leads for a future statement of here, this it was a fallacy that we talked about during cross-examination, kind of something like that.
Yeah. So you
So
never
it still
want
has to be a question.
Yeah. So it always has to be a question, and you always have to frame it as kind of a question from the jump. So one thing that kind of a lot of debaters start off with crossfire questions is they'll just say an argument and then they'll say, do you agree? And usually those questions are pretty much not going to get you anywhere, because most of the time your opponents are just going to say, no, I don't agree with your argument. Or your judge is going to think, it's kind of a lazy application of crossfire. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid those things. But yeah, you want to ask questions that maybe set up, or something that the information that you're including in your question gets at a different argument. And then you're going to use that in your speeches and use that to kind of highlight some of the logical problems with your opponent's arguments. It's definitely a good question. Okay, and then lastly, you want to kind of show off your knowledge. So the smarter you seem when you're asking questions, the more credible you're going to be, and the more the judge is going to believe and understand what you're pushing for in the rest of the debate. So you're going to dive deeper into previous examples, or maybe bring up new ones in order to drive home main points. And so basically, you're kind of showing off your knowledge of the topic, showing off your knowledge of debate, and trying to kind of make that happen. Someone else raise their hand?
Yes, Dylan. I would like to ask a question. I think there's this question that the kids might have in mind as well. Could you give us an example about the part where you talk about lazy application, and then try to make it into a real questions? Because like I did hear a few yesterday where the kids were asking a blah 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 blah. Do you agree? So is it okay if you give them one example to let them,
or is that something you'll get to pretty soon?
Yeah.
Because you said you're going to give some examples.
Yeah, so we can maybe talk about that. So something that you could do is instead of making a statement about kind of an argument that you're trying to forward. So maybe you're trying to say, I don't know how much of this topic that you all have kind of jumped into, but maybe you're trying to argue some premise about social media. You could, and you're trying to get to a definition to determine whether something is social media or not. You could, one way that is kind of the worst way of asking this question is, social media is things like Twitter, Instagram, etc. Do you agree? That's kind of not really going to be something that your opponents are really interested in answering straightforward, because maybe they have included something that you don't want to be included, and that's why you're asking this crossfire question. Instead, you can ask them to either explain what their definition of social media is, or ask questions about the parameters of that definition in order to kind of get at these claims. So it's kind of really all about just whatever idea you're getting at. You want to start it from the premise of a question rather than starting it from the premise of an argument in a statement and then ending it with, do you agree with what I'm saying? Because usually it's going to be off-putting, and your opponents aren't going to want to fall for your traps because they're not going to want to agree with your arguments. Okay, so we're going to move on to answering questions. So we're going to talk about some of the kind of strategies of answering these type of questions, and what your goal is when answering questions, since half of your crossfire time is dedicated to kind of answering the questions that your opponents are trying to set up. And so it's equally as important that we have prepared answers and ideas for our answers, as well as our questions. So we want to establish our credibility. So like we said, with asking questions, your goal is to kind of undermine the credibility of your opponent's evidence and your opponent. Instead, you want to show off how much you know your evidence and how much you know your arguments. So you can be really, really persuasive by showing different examples, referencing your evidence without having to look back at your contentions, without having to kind of, do some quick searches to come to different understandings. The more that you know, the more that's going to come out in Crossfire, and the more the judge is going to really want to vote for you. So the more familiar you are with your arguments, it's going to be really apparent as you talk in Crossfire. And it's okay to kind of look back and try and find an answer, or maybe ask your teammate to help you out with coming up for an answer. But usually the more time it takes and the more kind of searching it takes to come up with your answers, the more it's going to look like you're stalling or kind of avoiding different ideas instead of just coming out with an answer. So it's really always okay to kind of just say your first idea of what you think the correct answer is, even if you maybe aren't really sure or you're kind of uncertain of what you're saying. You should maybe just jump out and kind of go for it to show off what you know, because chances are you're going to be right, and chances are you know a lot about this topic. So you're gonna trust your kind of skill and ability to do that. You should defend your logic, defend your ideas. So you don't always have to agree with what they're saying. So some of their questions are setting you up for traps. So pay attention to maybe how they're phrasing, what information they're including. Like kind of Anthony said earlier, where he was talking about how you could maybe ask where they're going if they've asked a quick or a question a couple times, or maybe a confusing one, to try and see what their intentions are. Those are always really good ideas, because that way you can answer their questions more appropriately for them, as well as more appropriately for you. So that way it doesn't kind of set you up for failure, or maybe give in to some bad logic or bad ideas that your judge might vote against you for. So ensure that you're not gifting them some arguments that benefit their side. So make sure that you're always kind of referencing your evidence and referencing some examples that you have in order to kind of set up these ideas. You also want to sound really confident no matter what you're doing. So even when you don't know what you're saying, giving an answer that is your best guess and making it sound like it's not a guess is a really good skill. So you want to kind of be assertive, make sure that you sound kind of like you know what you're talking about, and that people should trust you, because it's going to show the judge that maybe your judge doesn't know you're wrong, or maybe your opponents don't know you're wrong. And so it's going to avoid some future problems of not sounding like you're credible, or not sounding like you know what you're saying. Next, you're going to want to be creative. So, so we really want to make sure that we're taking advantage of what we're doing in Crossfire. So maybe sometimes our plans won't go the way that we want them to. And so it's important to be flexible. You want to make sure that you're able to adapt to what's going on in the debate. So maybe if your opponents throw you off with a question or an answer, you might need to retool your strategies. So don't be too rigid and kind of have a planned set of Crossfire questions. Make sure that you can kind of adapt to whatever problems are going to happen. And then you also want to use examples. So I think I've said examples a bunch, but I really want to drive home this fact that Crossfire is about kind of letting us all understand what we're saying, and letting the judge figure out kind of these really deep and complex ideas that you all are debating about. And so the more you can use examples and help the judge understand what you're saying, and help them kind of simplify the debate, the better off you're going to be. So answering questions is really important for that, so that your judge can kind of get to what you're thinking about and make sure that they understand what you're arguing. So
rather than just saying yes or no, you're saying that you would, when they ask you a question about social media, you would instead give an example of social media and what you mean by that, instead of just saying, yes, that's social media, or this is social media, stop. Yeah,
so you want to definitely go beyond just a yes or no answer. You can kind of reference some arguments that you've maybe already made. So referencing back to your first constructive is going to show off how much you really know about your case, and also let the judge know kind of how your case interacts with what your opponents are arguing. And so that's always beneficial. So the more you can use what you've already talked about, and the more you can use maybe some historical examples, or maybe some things that you've learned in kind of your research or your classes, the more that the judge is going to be able to understand what you're talking about. So sometimes you might need to assume that your judge doesn't know anything about the topic, because maybe your judge, it's their first time learning about it or hearing about it, and they're not teaching classes about it, or they're not debating about it. So they might not know all the same things that you do. And so you should think of it as kind of coaching your judge through what all these arguments are. And so Crossfire is for your judge, it's not for your opponents. And so you need to think about it like that, thinking about it as explaining your arguments so that your judge kind of gets to and understands what you're saying. Okay, so things to avoid. So there's a lot of really common kind of issues that happen in Crossfire that we want to kind of prevent. So it's really important that you think through what you're asking for Crossfire, and you really want to try and plan out what you're saying, so that way you
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I have a little question.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you say that one more time?
Okay, so I have a little question.
Yeah,
could
go
I
ahead.
choose not to answer some of the question my opponent they ask? Can I choose not to answer them?
Oh, can you just not answer the question? Is that what you're saying?
Some of the question, yes.
You should always try and give an answer. So it's gonna, if your opponent asks a question and you say, I don't want to answer that, then it's gonna look like maybe you're guilty of something, right? So you want to kind of show that you are not trying to avoid certain ideas, but you can kind of twist your answer. Maybe if they're asking a really good question and you want to avoid actually giving the real answer to that, you can maybe talk about something that's kind of related, but not really, or you can kind of answer it in a sneaky way, but you don't really have to answer kind of the exact idea that they're saying, because a lot of times if you give a close enough answer, they're not going to want to spend their time asking that same follow-up question again. And because you only have so much time to ask questions in Crossfire. So yeah, if there's a question that's really, really difficult or really scary, you can kind of be sneaky about your answer, but you shouldn't just say, I don't want to answer this, because that might look a little bit worse.
So almost like Taiwanese culture, if there's a problem that you don't want to discuss, you discuss something else that's similar. So
It's
very much a
driven.
Taiwanese answer, if you don't mind me being culturally broad there.
Yeah, that could be a good skill for sure.
Well, if you choose not to answer a question, you could, it depends on what the question is. I mean, if the question is an irrelevant question, where the question you feel is not really related, you could kind of ask them to make sure whether your understanding was wrong. So it could be like, are you trying to understand the correlation between, or the relationship between this and that? Just try to make sure what you're asking, instead of immediately shooting them down. It's sort of like a communication, even though the Crossfire is there to do a certain amount of attack and defense, you still need to listen. Active listening is also important. Yeah. All right, I just chipped in. All right, I'm done.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no, 100%. I'm definitely, that's definitely one of the things to avoid, is to prioritize how much you're paying attention to your opponents. So asking kind of follow-up question. If someone asks you a question that you're confused about, or you don't understand the relevance, it's definitely always okay to ask them to maybe explain the question in a different way, so that way you make sure that you're answering what they want you to be answering, and so that the judge kind of can follow what's going on. So the first thing that I want to talk about of things to avoid is open-ended questions. So this is a question that maybe your opponents aren't really tied into saying a specific answer, but can say anything at all. So there's kind of a big value in making sure that you get exactly what you want, and that your opponents are answering questions really quickly, because the longer your opponents take to get their answers out, the less time you're going to have to ask future questions. So you want to make sure that there's only so much that they can say about their argument, and you're asking very directly about something. So open-ended questions that allow them to speak about, if you say, why is social media good? Or why do you believe this thing? They can talk about their evidence or their arguments for a very long time, because they just did it for 4 minutes. And so now you've given them extra opportunity to explain their arguments, sneak in new arguments, get an extra explanation so that the judge maybe understands their arguments more than yours. This makes it really easy to dodge the point of your question or allows them to get these added benefits. So making your questions more direct and having a good idea of what your opponents are going to say in response is going to definitely really benefit you. Judges, so there's kind of like two types of judges who think about Crossfire. So there's some judges who really pay really close attention to it. They're going to flow. They're going to use Crossfire for the rest of their debate, and they really love Crossfire. And then there's some judges who maybe are not really treating Crossfire with kind of its priority. And so you want to make sure that your speeches are catered towards both judges. And one thing that you can do with asking more direct questions that aren't these open-ended questions is you're going to show off to the judges who are paying really close attention, and you're not going to lose the judges who aren't paying that much attention because you're going to kind of get to the point really quickly and move through Crossfire and make it kind of entertaining and interesting for everyone. The next thing that we can avoid is long-winded questions. So these are questions that happen a lot with kind of newer PF debaters and newer debaters, and even the most experienced debaters kind of get trapped into these long-winded questions. So this is a question where maybe you have like 4 or 5 sentences where you're explaining your ideas and trying to get out a question. That's going to make your judge very confused, make your opponent very confused, and it's going to kind of scare everyone away from what you're saying. So make your questions short and to the point. So you can include sometimes some background information. Maybe you have to reference an argument that you're asking the question about, but you really want to keep them really condensed and to the point for making sure that everyone understands what's going on and doesn't get lost in kind of your arguments. Everyone is always fighting for time in Crossfire. So drawing out your questions to be really long makes everyone frustrated because they feel like maybe you're wasting their time to get to ask questions. So they're not going to want to answer your question as in-depth as maybe you would like them to if you're taking too long to ask these questions. So it's important to kind of save time. And then also you're going to make sure that everyone's kind of understanding what you're saying and not confused. The longer the question phrasing is, the more likely you are to lose your judge, not only in terms of how much they understand what you're saying, but also how much they think that you're going to get out of this Crossfire. So it's important to kind of prioritize getting short and to the point and making sure that you're kind of coming up with these ideas.
One of the things that I think you just mentioned was you could help by making a short statement to focus what you're going to ask about, but then ask a short question about that. And I think that's one of the things that beginner debaters sometimes are mistaking is they want to put the thing that they're trying to focus on into the middle of their question, which then draws the whole thing out, as opposed to saying, you talked about blah, blah, blah. My question is, and then that way it's like, here's what focus, short question, move on kind of a thing. And so I like the way you worded that. And I wanted to point that out to the group because that was nice.
Yeah, definitely the more kind of quick you can get these background information, these statements to focus the question, the better. So you don't want to spend too much time trying to set up your questions and making all these arguments in Crossfire. You want to keep it 2 questions and keep it to only very brief questions. But yeah, focusing it is definitely helpful. Another thing that maybe is a common mistake is focusing only on clarification. So sometimes we'll go into debate rounds and we maybe aren't really paying attention to what happens in the speeches. We're not following the evidence as closely, or maybe we just don't really understand what's going on, and that's okay. But we don't want to leave our Crossfire time to only just asking, hey, can you repeat this argument? Or, hey, can you explain this argument in a different way? It's definitely okay and encouraged for you all to ask for clarification. And I'm not saying that you should never ask for this clarification, but you want to really show off how much you know in Crossfire. And so if you spend your whole Crossfire time asking your opponents to restate things that they've already said or explain them in a different way, you're not getting the opportunity to show the judge kind of the arguments and ideas that you know. And so you want to kind of have a little bit of time dedicated to clarification where you can maybe get arguments that you missed. But you really want to focus on some of the other ideas about challenging the credibility, the logic, or the different ideas that your opponents have put out. So you want to show off that you know what's going on and that you were paying attention. So that way you can kind of, get most points from the judge and get the most respect from the judge.
So you're saying ideally you're going to be asking other questions than clarification, but for beginner debaters, if you were coaching a beginner debater and they really feel they don't understand something, would you say it'd be better to still move on and just wing it? Or would you say it'd be better to just still focus on clarification questions, even if you use your entire time on that? What would you recommend?
So that's kind of a tough one. So you definitely want to make sure that you know what's going on in the debate. So if you absolutely have no idea what your opponents are saying, it's definitely okay to ask clarification questions, because chances are a lot of times your judge might not know what they're saying as well. And so it's going to help everyone kind of get into what's going on, and the judge is going to understand why you're asking these clarification questions, because maybe they don't understand. But you don't want to have all of your time wasted on clarification, and so sometimes people use kind of clarification questions as a way to fill out the time, and so that's kind of really the main one that I'm trying to ask you all to avoid. Is instead to, if you want to fill out the time, maybe we're going to talk about some ideas on how to prepare for crossfires before tournaments in order to kind of avoid that problem. But if you really don't understand, it's definitely okay to ask those questions. Another strategy to avoid asking only clarification questions if you don't understand what's going on is you can talk to your partner. So your debate and debates with partners are all about teamwork. And so maybe if you were both paying attention and you didn't understand or you missed an argument that your opponent said, you can always turn to your partner and see if they got it, or see if they maybe have a different understanding as you before Crossfire or during the speech. So that way you can kind of make sure that you're on the same page and you can help each other out. So that's another way that teamwork comes to play in Crossfire, is you avoid these clarification questions by using the two brains of your team for the benefit of everyone. Okay, so then also you want to avoid being rude. So generally in debates, you obviously want to avoid being rude, and in real life, you want to avoid being rude. But PF debate is all about public speaking and the perception of the judge. So it's really going to hurt your standing if you come off as unlikable. And so you want to show kind of respect and kind of politeness in order to make your judge want to vote for you, because that's really all it's about. So Crossfire is the easiest place for this rudeness to come through. Like I talked about before at the very beginning, it's the only time where you're actually interacting with your opponents. So it's the easiest time for you to kind of butt heads and be upset. And since there's these time constraints and you're sharing questioning time, and you're trying to set each other up for tricks and stuff, everyone's kind of on edge. And so you want to be really polite and respectful in the way that you're asking. So you want to avoid coming off as short. So this is like, make sure that you're actually fully answering the questions that your opponents are asking. You want to try and be respectful of your opponent's arguments. So I think that, I forget who mentioned this before, but when maybe someone asks you something that you're confused about or doesn't seem relevant, you don't want to say, oh, that's irrelevant, I don't want to answer that question. You want to instead see and give them respect and assume that maybe they had, you maybe misunderstood what they were talking about. So ask them to explain more or rephrase their question, and that might help kind of resolve this problem without coming off as disrespectful of your opponents. And then you always want to ask your questions in a respectful manner. So you don't want to kind of come off like you think that their arguments are silly or bad, or you're assuming that they're not saying something that is worth listening. So you want to make sure that you're wording your questions in a way that is going to sound like you believe what your opponents are saying is smart, but you disagree with it. And then we want to avoid breaking structure. So the structure of Crossfire is kind of the pro or whoever spoke first will ask the question first, and then you'll give your answer. Then the other team will ask their question. Then you'll give your answer. Sometimes we will have time for follow-up questions, but generally you don't want to ask a ton of follow-up questions. And that's one way that you could break the structure is if one team just keeps asking questions over and over again, the judge is going to be pretty confused and not really want to, not really feel like you all are respecting each other and using the Crossfire time appropriately, because, instead of both teams asking questions, now it's just one team. And then, you want to take turns and politely ask for help. or politely ask for your follow-ups. So make sure that you seem gracious. That's going to avoid rudeness if someone allows you to ask a follow-up question, and you're going to say, once you get your answer, you can say, okay, yeah, that's sufficient, or you agree, that's fine. And then you can say that they can ask their question now. And so that way it's going to seem and come off really smooth, and make sure that the judges are getting the most out of Crossfire. And it also is going to save you time in the future, because you're kind of making sure that the Crossfire is running smoothly. So that way you can ask maybe some more extra questions because you're going to get through them a lot quicker. Okay, and then lastly, preparing for Crossfire. So we want to make sure that we're preparing for Crossfire just like we would any other speeches. So we're going to have preparation before the debate, during the debate, and after the debate, just like you would for your rebuttals or summaries or final focuses or constructives. So before the debate, you can have prepared questions to common arguments. So a lot of you all, especially at the camp tournaments or in the camp debates, or in the first couple of tournaments, you're going to know exactly what most people are going to say because everyone's kind of in the same boat. So you should have kind of a couple questions written out and that you bring with you, so that way you can use them to ask questions and sound really smart and kind of highlight all the different things that we said. You can also have prepared answers to common arguments and questions. So if there's something that you keep getting, and someone keeps asking you a certain question, you can kind of script out what you're going to answer. And you can work with your coaches and your teammates to come up with the best ways to answer these questions. So some of the strategies that I like to use is doing things called extended crossfires, where both people are asking and answering questions, but you're going to have do it for even longer than you would normally do. So maybe instead of the 3-minute crossfire, everyone has to ask questions for 5 minutes. And so that's going to kind of train you to get better at asking these questions and answering them. And it's going to be allowing you to work with your teammates to come up with what people might say and what people might ask you in order to be prepared for anything at the tournament. Then you also want to be working with your teammates to brainstorm new questions. So you all can come up with new ideas for questions before tournaments and work together to kind of have that list of prepared questions. And you can practice answering questions that maybe you didn't already know. So your teammates, if they come up with a question, they can ask it to you about your contention. And maybe your job is going to be to try and get through these questions that maybe might be harder. And then during the debate. So sometimes, so always you want to know what you're going to ask going into your speech. So a lot of times what people a common mistake that people make is they kind of forget about Crossfire before they're going to give the Crossfire, and then they jump in and they have no idea what to say. So one thing that I like to do is, as I'm taking notes of my opponent's speeches, I'm going to write out the questions on my flow paper as I'm trying to come up with these different ideas if I didn't already have these prepared questions to ask. So that way, as you're taking notes, you're kind of thinking about their arguments and you're coming up with questions and keeping them in an organized place. So that way you can remember exactly what you wanted to ask. The next thing that you want to do is to talk with your partners about what you want to get out of Crossfire. So it's important to try and build towards your final focus, and everyone on your team is in the same page. So without talking with your partner, you can't know about what your goals are. So it's really important to kind of make sure that you're working together as a team in these Crossfires and working towards the common goal of winning the debate in the final focus. And then after the debate, you can break down questions that maybe you were confused about, or maybe if you think that someone asked a really, really good question, you can talk with your coaches or your teammates about how to better answer those things. So you shouldn't always just forget about the question once you got through the debate. Even if you won or lost, that question might come back in the future or in another debate. And so it's important that you figure out what's going on and learn about how to put together these questions and make these answers a lot better. You also can write out answers to common questions. So if there's a question that people keep asking you, you can come up with a prepared answer and have that ready to go. And you can give redos on how to answer these questions. So you want them to sound like they're flowing and that you know what you're talking about and that everything kind of makes sense and you're not just reading them off. So the more you practice questioning and answering after the debate, the better off you're going to be suited for giving effective crossfires. So I think that's it for me. If anybody has questions now, we can ask about that, and then we're going to do some practice activities with Crossfire. So does anybody have any questions about the things that I've brought up?
In the chat, there's a good question that says, will there be some question form or key sentences to be given for them to use? And I know we don't have a prepared list off the top of my head, but what would you suggest for some really good basic questions for them to be almost always able to ask?
Well, you can always, so like kind of you said in the chat that it's dependent on kind of what your opponents are saying. We're definitely going to do some practice of how to ask crossfire questions and how to come up with crossfire questions in the activity in a second. But one thing that you all can do is, as you're kind of figuring out what about the topic, and I think you all are doing the topic lecture later today, is that right? Yeah, so as you're kind of introducing these arguments, you can maybe see if you can point out some of these like issues that you think are with these common arguments on the pro and the con. So you can talk to your teammates and your coaches about some of the ideas that are going to be introduced in this topic lecture, and write out maybe some of these questions. So you want to have them built for getting at certain ideas or establishing certain parameters for the debate. And so those are always good ways to start off with your questions.
One quick strategy is, because a lot of times you're going to have to prepare for both sides of the topic. As you probably know the weak points of your own arguments, we'll say on the pro side, if you're the con team, think about what questions you would be afraid the con or the team they might have asked you. And so that way you can poke, and if they have a great answer for that question, then next time you're the pro side, you're prepared because you've heard their answer that could be used later. And that's, again, same thing for the other way around. So if you're the pro team, think about your con arguments and think about where you think your arguments are weak, even if it's slightly different than what they propose. A lot of times your questions that would poke at your own plan are still going to help you to poke at their plan or find holes in their plan. Very often they're going to be similar as you prepare. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that's definitely a good idea. So using kind of ideas that maybe not just your teammates come up with, but your opponents as well, will help you fill out some stuff. So like I said, preparing your crossfire questions, you can kind of make a list of the common arguments that you know you're going to have and that you know that your opponents are going to say on the pro or the con. And you can come up with some ideas with your teammates or with your coaches. And you can even do that today after you hear the different ideas about the topic. You can come up with some questions about those, and that will definitely help you out in the tournament. Yeah.
So you have mentioned we should not ask open-ended question. So is that we should ask yes and no question, because sometimes my opponent just answer no or yes, and
yeah, you don't want to just ask like do you agree, yes or no, or like is this true, yes or no, but kind of asking more direct arguments that get to a certain point is kind of what I'm getting at. So you don't want to ask them a question where they could say anything, but you do want to ask them questions that are going to get them to explain something. So it's really not good if you say like, why do you believe this thing? Or why do you think social media is good? Or why do you think, it's important to get something about their contention? But because then they're going to be able to talk about, all the different reasons. They can say any of their different justifications. But if you're asking about like a focused idea, that's going to make it easier for or force them to kind of say what you want them to say and say something that makes that gets you something rather than them being able to talk about anything. So just kind of close the parameters or close the lines on what they can say.
Right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had some technical problems. So I didn't get most of your lectures, but I still want to ask, what if I really have nothing to say when answering the question? I really don't know what to say. Do you have some like techniques or some skills to show that I am seemingly smart or I'm seemingly had something in my head? What if I really don't have things to say? What's
Yeah.
your suggestion?
Yeah, that's always a tough situation, right? So if they're asking you something that you have totally no idea about, and you probably should have an idea about it, then you're obviously not in the best situation that you want to be. But there are definitely some ways that you can do it. So you can kind of take different portions of what they've asked, or maybe a similar idea that's kind of related, and talk about that in order to make it sound like you maybe misunderstood the question, or the judge understands it in the way that you're talking about it now. So that way it kind of doesn't seem like you don't know what you're saying, but you're talking about something that's closely related to what they're saying. So kind of can trick the judge and trick your opponents into thinking you answered the argument when you actually haven't, by kind of referencing the different ideas that they had in their argument that you do know about, and avoiding the ones that you don't know about.
You mean,
To add on to what he's saying, and I think this may also answer your question. Okay. If you get to Crossfire and you're the one that's asking the questions, and you're like, I've got no questions. Questions you can always ask are, and this is what I tell my students as the go-tos is, can you explain, insert whatever, in your own words? So you don't want them to, the reason you ask that, and you ask it in your own words, is because it looks like you are pressing your opponents to ensure they understand their argument. So you never want them to just repeat what they said, right? We don't want to give them free time to just be like, yeah, let me restate it all. But can you explain X in your own words? Another is, if there are any questions or words or phrases that are in the resolution that you could always ask questions about, that's good to be prepared. So like for this one, our resolution, you could always ask, what do you think social media means? Or how are you defining insert key phrase or word from the resolution? And those types of questions will always work. But what Dylan is saying about ensuring you have questions ready to go before the tournament for the first match ever happens is very, very important. Some of the students that I worked with over the semester, one of the big things we spent a lot of time on was crafting and writing questions for Crossfire or cross-examination that they could use in any given debate round based on the topic. And we spent a lot of time shortening the questions, making sure the question was very clear, to the point. And so just like you prepare in writing your speeches and rewriting them, you need to spend almost, if not more time, preparing and writing questions before you even go somewhere.
so you mean you could answer the question by asking a question?
Yes, sometimes. The one other thing I want to add, in addition to the smart things Shannon and Dylan just said, is if you are asked something that's completely out of left field, something totally random, and it's not something that you know about because it's just too detailed. Like, you talk about activism in Taiwan, your contention names a bunch of movements, and they start asking you like, oh, can you name who all the leaders of the movements are? It's totally fine to be like, no, I cannot. I don't know. If you need that information, I can get that for you during prep time. But like, no, I have not memorized the names of all the movement leaders. Like, and as long as it's, you can't do this for all questions, because you do at some point want to obviously show off your knowledge, like Dylan said. But on a couple of occasions, if you don't know something, then it's totally okay. And the judge is not going to expect you to know all there is to know about your argument.
One quick thing that I would like to add is that if there is something that was confusing in their question, it could be that their question wasn't clear enough for you to know how to answer it. Well, you can actually restate the question to them. So do you mean, and then restate the question in a way that you can answer it. Because a lot of times if you restate it in a similar or close way, I can even, I mean, I'm not planning to do that every time. I'm going to try to answer their question. But if they ask me a question and I wasn't sure, what they meant, I can say, do you mean? And then I state a question that is close to what they're asking that I do know the answer to. Very often they're going to be like, yeah, that's what I meant. Or they will restate the question in a way that gives me more time to think of an answer.
Yeah, definitely. All those are really good strategies.
So Dylan, what you just said is that actually, even if we don't understand their questions, we can try to pretend that we understand their question, but we answer the question in another way. I mean, they're asking question A, but we say, yeah, I understand your question A, but this is my solution B. Can we do that?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's what you mean?
Yeah, so you can, if you are confused about the question, you can kind of talk about some ideas that are closely related. So it seems like you're answering the same question. And so it's gonna show that maybe you know something about the topic. The judge might think it's a miscommunication error if they even pick up on it. And usually you're going to be, fine. And it's not going to look like you were avoiding it or running into any trouble. And so the smoother you can do that, the better it's going to look. So it's a good thing to practice for sure.
Even more true here because of the language barrier as well. I mean, if you're doing that in an international competition or, an American competition, they don't expect there to be as many language misunderstandings.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so you could just chalk it up to a language misunderstanding and you'll be good. It's perfect. It's the best excuse. Yeah, the message in the chat is definitely true. So you don't want to do that for every question. So there's obviously these are like tricks in like the most extreme situations that you can use to get out of really tough questions. But if you do it every time, then it's going to seem like you have no idea what you're talking about. And the judge is going to be very confused if you just keep answering these questions with something totally irrelevant. So definitely use it sparingly and make up for it in the other questions that they ask by kind of showing how smart you are and how much you know about your stuff. Because then that makes it seem more like it's like a fluke of some misunderstanding if the judge picks up on it, rather than a consistent kind of idea of pivoting away from what you're talking about.
Do the judges have a criteria or small chart that they could kind of give us point under the table to say, oh, this team +1, this team -1, according to our Crossfire? Or yeah, or they just vote for us from their like intuition, or what was that, like instinct? How do they judge? How do they give the points?
Well, so in public forum that I've worked with, there's definitely no points. I don't know if you all have integrated any of those points into the public forum version that you're doing. So Anthony or Chana can maybe speak to that a little bit more. But usually what the judges are voting on and kind of learning and using Crossfire to learn about is the content of your arguments and showing off kind of how smart you are and how good you sound. So when I kind of talk about like your credibility and your ability to show off to the judge, that's really what Crossfire is all about. And that's what the whole speech is about and the whole debate is about. So you really want to convince the judge that you're someone to vote for. So even if there's not like a set like point criteria, the more likable you seem and the more your arguments make sense and the more they sound really good, the higher chance you are going to have to win the debate. So it's not really kind of like a formulaic thing, but it's really all about kind of the style that you put into it and the ideas that you put into it and how you kind of show that off to the judge. So if the judge sees that you have this like really smart idea and they really like it and you kind of are following all the steps that I mentioned and then that you all will I'm sure hear about for constructives, rebuttals, and summaries and final focuses, you're going to be in a really good position to win debates.
Yeah,
the judge is different. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add, since you were asking specifically about point tallies, one thing we are kind of modifying to American public forum. So like Dylan said, in American public forum, the judge votes based on only whoever has the best argument. And in our modified version, you may be used to seeing those like rubrics or those sheets that say like, oh, there's a strategy category, there's a delivery category, there's a teamwork category. And we will still give you sheets that look like that basically describe, here are the things to be looking for in the Crossfire. The difference is you won't automatically, like the winner of the debate is not who got the most points. The winner is still who made the best argument. So the points are still there. It's just kind of like a more of a guideline than a rule for deciding who the winner is.
So in the debate, it's not only the content that you are showing, but also you have to a bit acting, right? Even you have nothing to say, you have to act. I am confident, I am smart, although that might not be the truth, but so debating includes a little bit acting.
Yeah.
I would say more, a lot more in public forum than in, say, policy debate when it comes to, I guess, the acting. I mean, it's done in all forms of debate, but I would say public forum is probably one of the ones that there's a lot more acting and a little less on all of the evidence and you know, how was your plan and how are all of these, you know, like technical things. So it depends on which form of debate, but I'm still fairly new to public forum, even though I've judged it and had some experience with it. So please, other people chime in. Sorry.
Well, to answer the question for Ms. Hong, I think like if you're looking for a criteria, well, we have some, like for NTNU, there are aspects that we would want you to your kids to try to get to reach, but that is not like separated into categories in order to get you the points and tally them, because it's not exactly like a test. If it was like a test, is that okay, you got the multiple choice questions, this is how many points, you got this number on the essay, and then so add together, did you pass or did you not pass? That's not how debate works, because debate is a holistic evaluation. It's a holistic evaluation of how the debaters do. So it all goes back to ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos, pathos, logos. I'm pretty sure that there are certain books in city libraries. I think there is city libraries or school libraries that might have that. And even in maybe Mandarin debates, some of them, or even a civics teacher might have that. Maybe a civics teacher, like a social studies teacher might have that. All right, civics teacher might have that. It's not hard to learn, it's just hard to train. It's hard to learn, it's hard to train. That means that when you're selecting people, it's going to be important. You're going to have to rely on your experience as a teacher. Like, who has it in them? Who did not get the appreciation that they deserved back in the day, and they have something to prove, but they didn't have anywhere to go. This is the opportunity. So you're going to have to think about it in a less of a criteria manner, or like a, you know, rubrics manner, and think about it as a holistic training. That way you can get your kids not only to improve in English, but also in all other fields.
As Shannon just pointed out, because ethos, logos, and pathos, ethos is your credibility. So it's important that you sound credible, whether it's true or not true. And then pathos is the emotion that you're getting from your judge. Like, do they agree with you, or just on a instinctual, in their heart level, do they agree with you? And then, of course, there is logos, which means the logic. So that does mean that logic is definitely there. But two of those three aren't even logic. Whereas in other forms of debate, there is maybe more emphasis on logic and evidence and things like that for your plan. So this, in ethos, pathos, logos, there's two of the three that you could be illogical and still pull off a debate. I mean, as we pointed out, gay marriage last time there was this thing about gay marriage in New York was going to cause nuclear war. So, Shannon, I'm going to bring that up because that is absolutely ridiculous, but she won the debate because she was creditable probably and evoked an emotional response because emotion plays a role. So anyway, just pointing out you can win.
So for example, my last question, if you have a team member who look so nervous and shake all the time, but he or she got the excellent argument during the debate,
Credible.
they would have the chance to be like to win the favor of the judges.
Content matters. Content does matter.
There's been a lot of rounds, I will say, especially in novice debates, where both will be shaking because it's their very first round. Both of them, it's their first round. They're like, ugh. And I just ignore it. I don't worry about it because I'm not concerned with personally if you are shaking and worried and nervous. I'm worried with, will you think through what's going on? And I'm going to watch your content and what you're saying rather than focus wholly on how you're saying it, if that makes sense.
I think it's important that you said entry level because judges understand that a lot of this is a learning process and this is meant to be beginner level. This isn't meant to be, you're going to compete across the world yet. So there's definitely a lot more acceptance of you're still unsure of yourself. That's acceptable so long as you're following and contending and having a discussion. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I would reassure, if anything, I'd reassure my students, look, you're beginners. This is acceptable. You're at a beginning level. Yes, there are going to be people who seem more confident than you, and that's okay as long as you still are doing your best. The judges are going to weigh that less at a beginning level.
Also, if the
should be given more time to you guys.
If the students look at me, and this is anywhere I'm judging, and they're like, I have no idea what happens next. I will always be like, hey, that's cool. Everybody starts somewhere. This is what happens next. And generally the students be like, oh, okay, cool. And they'll keep going with the debate. So one of the things, so NTNU always has a moderator, even in person, to help with that. So you don't have to worry about it at NTNU as a judge, memorizing, what happens, who goes, how long is everything, because someone's there to moderate all of that. And then as for the US, there's always, or almost always, at least a box on your ballots that will give you the time and the order of how the debate goes so that you can reference that for the students. And then other times, what I do at my tournaments is I always have a packet for my new judges that have never judged before, that will go through every single speech. We'll be like, here's what to expect in this speech. Here's what to expect in this speech. Here's how long these speeches are. That way, if they are judging a novice team and a novice team is like, I have no idea what happens next, the judge can turn to that packet and be like, oh, well, the packet says do this. And then students will generally like, oh yeah, my coach told me about that. And they'll do it in some capacity. I would share my packet, but my packet is very, very detailed to the style of debate I coach with my collegiate students. It's not public forum at all, so it would not be helpful.
But like the activity that we did in Breakout, that was very simple, broken down into, speaker 2 is gonna question or challenge speaker 1, and that's basically what you give your students to run with. And then however they interpret that, that's a good starting point. Very simple.
Yep.
So, sorry, we're jumping a little bit away from just Crossfire, but Dylan, we should probably pull this a little bit back. Dylan, it's been a great session. I'm worried we're going over, and I'm not supposed to run this anyway, so oops.
No, definitely all good ideas. I would agree, though. Everyone should be more concerned about what you're arguing rather than how you sound, because the presentation aspect of it is always kind of a tool to improve the arguments and the content of what you're saying, not really the end of what you're trying to accomplish. So really, we want to focus on getting across your arguments, and then secondarily, we can focus about how you present them.
And Dylan, you pointed out earlier how you need to be respectful of your opponents, and specifically how like you can't talk down to them like they're dummies. So keep in mind that if your opponents are belittling you, your judge is, so if your opponents are talking like, oh, these people are so dumb, your judge is actually going to be like, wow, these people are so rude. And they will be taking points from them, and they will be losing credibility. And you, who are the struggling team, going, I don't know what to. The judge is going to be, their heart will be going, oh, you know, they're trying so hard, and they'll actually be, you know, forgiving for you. Whereas your opponents who are like, you don't understand my question, you know, we're like, okay, yeah, the judge understood the question, but obviously you could be nicer to your opponents, and that's part of debate. And they're being assessed as jerks, for, you know, simple word.
I think a lot of times, and the reason why Ms. Hong or the teacher over there has so many concerns is because I understand that in Taiwan there are local speech competitions where they have a very strong emphasis, I should say, on like form and like the way they present the speech. And sometimes it really gets on my nerves. I'm just going to be really honest about it. It really gets on my nerves because of the fact that it sounds like a propaganda speech coming from either North Korea or elsewhere. And I really don't understand why it's still existent within a democratic country. The fact that it will sound like something along the lines of something like this: the top U.S. military officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of General Mark Miley. That's how it sounds like, and that to me has no correlation to a debate. All right, that's save that stuff for something where you have an authoritarian regime. We are here to do a debate, so you don't need to worry so much about the form. Like, but the other kids from like these schools speak really good English. We train kids to break down the people who speak really good English but lack the logic. And if their speech is pre-written or prepared by someone else, that's even better, because that means they have no understanding of it. That means you get to kill them in Crossfire.
Okay, so before we get too off topic, everything is awesome. We do have a schedule we need to stick to, especially with for Dylan's time.
Sorry, Dylan.
Are there? It happens.
Sorry, Dylan.
Are there other questions about Crossfire that you would like to discuss? Because first, but then we're going to move into doing some for the students Crossfire activities. For the teachers, we're going to be doing what are some activities you can use to teach Crossfire? How do you coach Crossfire? And then also structuring debate classes. So any last questions about anything Dylan asked? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, since Dylan, you've talked about being polite, I want to know how, because we have to attack when we ask questions, and how can we show how silly our opponents are, but being polite at the same time? Can we be sarcastic, but in a very polite way?
Yeah, so that's definitely a hard line to walk, right? So you want to avoid coming off like super rude and dismissive, but you also want to show the judge that maybe they've said something that's totally silly and we shouldn't even have it introduced into our arguments, right? So you want to kind of toe that line very carefully. So sometimes you can be a little bit like, you can show a little bit of sarcasm, but really what you want to do is ask questions that kind of highlight these issues, but do it in kind of a tone, in a manner, and a wording that's respectful. And then in your speeches, you can kind of show and tell the judge exactly how that question and how that answer proves kind of your broader argument about why their argument is silly. So even though you kind of want to show how silly it is in Crossfire is really setting it up for the judge to understand what their arguments are and setting up how you're going to explain your answers later. So especially given that you're trying to get them to say something a certain way, the more polite and respectful you sound there, the more maybe willing and off guard they will be about giving kind of a silly answer about their silly argument. And then you can show off that in the speech about how kind of ridiculous the argument is, where you're not actually like directly interacting with your opponents, because in your speech you can be a little bit more disparaging of your opponent's arguments, because if you do that in your Crossfire, it's going to seem like a little bit rude because you're like directly talking to them. But in your speech, you can talk about kind of how ridiculous it is based off of the answers and the questions that you've already asked.
All right, awesome questions. And I will say, just to add to Dylan, because yes, he's 100% right. I was a very sarcastic debater. Very sarcastic debater. And a lot of it was really through my face. I would be like, how does this really solve the problem?
If I can chime in really quick, sarcasm can give you credibility, but it doesn't give you points for being polite. So if I want to be a know-it-all, I can be sarcastic and come off as, I'm going to win this debate because you're not creditable. You're challenging their credibility. But I'm not going to win any nice, polite points, which is going to be like, am I likable? No, I'm not likable if I'm really, really sarcastic. So you have to kind of, that's a strategic choice that you're going to display to the judge. And you can't really pull off, I'm a nice person and I'm a sarcastic jerk at the same time. You can be nice or a sarcastic jerk. So obviously, Shanna's a jerk. No.
In debate, I kind of was, actually, to be completely honest. Yeah. I was like, I don't care about nice points. I care about winning the debate. But I also did a much, yeah, I was very cutthroat as a debater.
Wow.
But that was me. As we can see, I have changed a lot as an adult. So yeah.
But your students can be nice and be fine. And if somebody is being sarcastic and rude, just deal with it, realizing that they are losing points in some way, even if they are gaining some points. So just defend yourself the best you can.
Yeah, and some people can pull off the sarcasm and the little bit of like being rude in Crossfire. Some people can't. So it's about just practicing, seeing what you can do, seeing what you're good at, and kind of, if you can convince the judge that your sarcasm is a reason that they're going to trust your arguments more, then all better to you, right? And so it's all about what your judge
one teammate sarcasm and one teammate nice also works. I've seen that too.
Good cop, bad cop, but yeah. Good cop, gap. Yeah. I think for Miss Hong, if you want to train your kids, like at least let them be able to withstand sarcasm. Withstand it. If they're nice people, just withstand it. All right, I'm done chipping.
Okay.
Sorry.
So real quick, and then we're gonna do breakout rooms. So I got some a couple really good questions straight to me via chat that I just want to go over, and then we're gonna do breakout rooms. So first was, I lost it. When you ask questions to challenge the credibility, is it that you are questioning the actual source of your opponent's argument? And the answer is yes. So if you're like, where did that source come from? And in the United States, if their response is, oh, Fox News, right? That's a problem. I don't know what the equivalency would be in Taiwan, but
news
yes.
For red or news for a blue group and green group. There's different parties that specifically tailor news here in Taiwan for blue and green.
So there you go.
Specifically from the blue group news or the green group news, you'd say, okay, that's not, really acceptable.
Kind of, yeah. You do the really look, just like I do, and anyone's like, oh, Fox News. I'm like, really? And then also there was a question. So before Crossfire, you can actually ask for their source and then question it during Crossfire. And the answer is yes. You can ask, may I see your card on insert whatever? And that's a very common question. In the United States, common practice is we just give each other our cases at the beginning of our speeches for most of the time so that you can follow along. I know that is not the norm practice at NTNU, but being able to look at each other's evidence and having those evidence cards ready to go is 100% the norm for any style of debate. You can always ask for it. You always should ask for it if you're like, what are you talking about? Quickly, Nate, and then we'll switch.
So just on that point, in a lot of debate, you're even allowed to get up and look over the shoulder of the person who's speaking, reading their debate if they haven't forwarded it to you. Because sometimes in debate, they speak too fast or they're unclear or something like that. So it is definitely something that is done in debate and very commonly practiced. But I find Taiwanese people sometimes have a hard time feeling comfortable getting up saying, I'm going to read over your shoulder, you know, something like that. So I'm not sure with the public forum, the new rules that are come out, but I'm sure that it will be adjusted as it goes. Yeah, sorry.
And then last one, because we just got it. If I accidentally answer a question wrong during cross, can I correct myself later? That's a great question. I'm going to answer it, and then I want Dylan, and then I'm putting a halt to all questions. So my answer is that yes, you can correct yourself if you catch yourself quick enough. So if you answer something and you're like, oh, you know, this is the answer. And then about, you know, a little bit later, you're like, oh, wait, hold on. I'm really sorry. I answered your question wrong. The actual answer is this. That's usually okay. But if you answer a question, you're like, here's the answer. Then they get up in their speech and they're like, here's why that answer is bad. Here's how it harms them. Here's why they should lose because of that answer. You can't get up in your next speech and be like, oh, that's not what I meant. I really meant to say this thing. Because that's really, it's bad for competition because I can't predict when you're going to change your answer to get out of an argument. So if you start out and you're like, yeah, that thing's amazing, absolutely, and you know, mid-sentence you're like, oh, wait a minute, no, take that back, I didn't mean that, what I really mean is no, that's fine, but you can't do it like in a following speech. And then I'd like Dylan to, if he has anything to add.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. So like you want to be careful about your clarifications, so you don't want to wait too long. But if there's like a reason for why you answered a question like in a way that they're maybe talking about it and you want to clarify something, you can also say maybe you were confused about the wording or reference the reason for why you answered something in a way that maybe they're misperceiving your argument. So that's always okay. And you want to make sure that you're kind of getting your points across very clearly. And so that's always important. But sometimes if you maybe made a mistake and said something wrong, you know, it's always okay to kind of let your judge know that. Or sometimes, you know, it might work out better for you and maybe you have to defend that. So just go with whatever is going to make it easier for your judge to follow along with what's going on and for you to get across your arguments and win the debate.